Now that you've spent some time identifying the parts of the urinary system, let's describe the functions of the parts of the urinary system. You may have already read a little bit about this using the textbook or the online resources that were available for the last portion of this unit, but we'll hopefully add to it at this point. First, we have the kidneys. We have two kidneys that are located high on the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. The kidney is a reddish-brown bean-like structure, and each kidney is about 10 centimeters long and 5 centimeters wide and 2.5 centimeters thick. We'll take a closer look at the kidneys in just a few minutes here because ultimately the kidneys are responsible for making urine. The two ureters connect the kidneys with the bladder. The ureters are long, about 25 to 33 centimeters. They're slender, muscular tubes capable of peristalsis, like the intestines. Urine moves along the ureters from the kidneys to the bladder in response to both gravity and the peristaltic movement of the ureters. We have the urinary bladder. This functions as a temporary reservoir for the storage of urine. How much urine can the bladder hold? We'll see later when we take a closer look at the bladder that there are actually folds in the wall of the bladder that allow it to expand to increase the amount of urine that it can hold. The urge to urinate usually begins when there's about 200 milliliters of urine inside the bladder, but a fairly full bladder can contain about 500 milliliters of urine. An extremely full bladder may contain up to a liter of urine. Finally, we have the urethra. The urethra is the tube that carries urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. There's two differences between the male urethra and the female urethra. The first is that the female urethra is shorter relative to the male urethra. As well, the female urethra is only responsible for carrying urine, whereas in the male, the urethra is part of both the urinary and reproductive systems. So as we said earlier, let's take a closer look now at the kidney. Zooming in on the kidney, we can see a number of regions that we want to discuss here. We'll start with the hilus. The hilus is the regions where blood vessels enter and exit from the kidney. Furthermore, it's the connection point for the ureter to the renal pelvis that we'll take a look at in a minute. Here we have the renal artery, bringing oxygenated blood into the kidney. Here we have the renal vein, bringing deoxygenated blood out of the kidney. Ultimately, though, the kidney is responsible for filtration, so the renal artery is bringing in wastes. And then the renal vein is, if you will, the cleaned out blood that leaves the kidneys. The outermost region of the kidney is the cortex, or renal cortex. The prefix renal just refers to kidneys in this case. So the cortex is the outermost portion of the kidney, and the medulla is the innermost portion of the kidney. In the medulla, you find the renal pyramids. In this image here, you can see that there are multiple renal pyramids within the medulla. We'll take a look at the nephron, the functional unit of the kidney, here in a moment, but ultimately, it's the nephrons that make urine. When the nephrons make urine, it runs down through the renal pyramid in structures we'll take a look at in a minute, down to the renal pelvis. As the urine connects from all the nephrons that makes up the kidney within the renal pyramids, it collects to the renal pelvis, and then ultimately the urine travels down the ureter to the bladder until eventually it's released out of the body through the urethra that we took a look at earlier. If we were to take a closer look at the kidney, we'd find the functional unit of the kidney, as we mentioned earlier, the nephron. This image is fairly complex to start with, but let's take a look at the location of where you find the nephron within the kidneys. The upper portion of the nephron would be found here within the cortex. We took a look at the cortex earlier when we were looking at the gross anatomy of the kidney. Some of the nephron would dip down into the medulla portion of the kidney. Because this image is fairly complex to start with, let's look at a simplified version of the nephron. The blood vessels that enter into the nephron form the glomerulus. The glomerulus is made up of capillaries that go into the Bowman's capsule. As blood travels through the glomerulus, wastes, water, electrolytes, and other things we'll take a look at in a moment will leave from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. As that filtrate is collected in the Bowman's capsule. It will then travel to the proximal convoluted tubule. The term proximal convoluted tubule refers to proximal, meaning closest to, in this case closest to the Bowman's capsule. Convoluted is referring to twists and turns, and so as you can see in our more complex image here, the proximal convoluted tubule is taking lots of twists and turns within the nephron. The proximal convoluted tubule turns into the descending limb of the loop of Henle. The urine travels down the descending limb and then up the ascending limb. As it travels up the ascending limb, it arrives at the distal convoluted tubule, the convoluted tubule that is furthest away from the Bowman's capsule. The distal convoluted tubule ultimately releases the formed urine into the collecting duct that then travels down to the renal pelvis that we took a look at earlier. Taking a look at the more complex image that we see below here, we can start with the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, just like we saw above in our simpler version. We can see that blood is coming into the glomerulus, into the capillaries that make it up, and then we have the Bowman's capsule that will collect the materials that come out of the blood. We have the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. Again, as mentioned before, once the urine is formed in the distal convoluted tubule, it empties into the collecting duct. As you can see here in this image, the collecting duct has many regions where various descending convoluted tubules will be attaching to it from various nephrons. It's important to pause here and say that the nephron relative to the kidney, not shown via this image here, is much smaller than the kidney. It's the functional unit. It's much smaller to the extent of there are actually 1 million nephrons per kidney. And so this functional unit that ultimately makes the urine, there are many of them functioning to process the blood, take out any wastes and so on, and get rid of them in the urine. To take a closer look at the blood vessels here, we can see that here we have a blood vessel coming from the renal artery. The blood will branch off to an afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole is an arteriole that leads up to the glomerulus. Here we have the efferent arteriole that comes out of the glomerulus. And it's important to think here about strategies for remembering this. How I remember the afferent arteriole, the A stands for at, and the E for efferent stands for exiting. As the blood leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole, the blood vessels surround the tubules of the nephron. For that reason, they're called the peritubular capillaries. Ultimately, as these capillaries move around the various structures of the nephron, they give off oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the nephron itself. But as well, as we'll see in a few minutes, they also pick up materials from the convoluted tubules as well as the loop of Henle. The peritubular capillaries ultimately then collect back to the renal vein. So let's name the process involved in the actual urine formation and describe the action of each. There are actually 3 steps in the process of urine formation. We're going to take a look at each of those one at a time, but now that we have a slightly larger picture here, let's again reiterate the portions of the nephron. Here we have the glomerulus, where blood comes in from the afferent arteriole and travels through it and then leaves through the efferent arteriole. Here we have the Bowman's capsule that collects the materials that have come out of the blood, proximal convoluted tubule, peritubular capillaries that extend from the efferent arteriole, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct that leads down ultimately to the renal pelvis. Let's take a look at the first step in urine formation, which is filtration. This occurs in the glomerulus. Ultimately, because the glomerulus is made up of capillaries, the blood traveling through the capillaries is under high pressure because the capillaries are very narrow. Because the blood is under high pressure, a lot of the materials, the smaller materials like water and electrolytes, and wastes like urea and creatinine, which we'll see later on, will ultimately be forced out of the capillaries of the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. This process is called filtration. Up to 180 liters of blood per day are filtered within the kidneys. You might ask the question, well, 180 liters per day, but I don't urinate 180 liters worth of urine each day. And that's because, again, this is just the first step in urine formation, and two other steps are important in getting us down from the 180 liters per day that is actually filtered down to the approximately 1.5 liters that we actually urinate on average per day. Those processes are reabsorption. Approximately 178.5 liters per day are actually absorbed back in from the length of the tubule into the peritubular capillaries. Most of this reabsorption occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule. So shortly after the Bowman's capsule, while the filtrate is moving into the proximal convoluted tubule, most of the reabsorption of the 178.5 liters per day occurs as the fluid moves from the proximal convoluted tubule into the peritubular capillary. The reason for this movement of the fluid back into the peritubular capillary is that after the blood leaves from the glomerulus, a lot of filtrate has been formed, and now the concentration of the blood has increased. As the blood travels through the peritubular capillary next to the proximal convoluted tubule, a lot of the water is attracted towards the high concentration blood found in the peritubular capillary, and therefore, undergoing the process of osmosis, most water is actually returned to the blood at this point. Reabsorption also takes place along other regions of the nephron, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. However, there's various hormones that are involved in this. The first is aldosterone, which plays a role in the distal convoluted tubule. Aldosterone plays a role in transporting sodium from the tubule back into the blood. When sodium moves out of the tubule back into the peritubular capillaries, water will move via osmosis, attraction for the higher concentrated blood area because the sodium has been moved into it, and the water will move back into the blood vessels as well, increasing the water volume of our blood. ADH, which stands for anti-diuretic hormone, which sounds like a mouthful, but anti meaning against, and diuretic meaning urine formation. This is the hormone that is against urine formation. And so what it is involved in is actually the reabsorption of water from the collecting ducts back into the peritubular capillary network. Finally, we have tubular secretion. As shown here, it says some solutes. Some solutes, as in step number 3, shown in the top part of the nephron, the distal convoluted tubule, are actually secreted actively out of the peritubular capillaries into the urine that is forming within the distal convoluted tubule. In this way, we can actually, again, fine-tune our blood in terms of excreting any electrolytes or other wastes that ought not to be in our blood and maybe weren't removed through the filtration process. Let's do another overview here where we name the process involved in urine formation and describe the action of each in slightly more detail. Let's take a look specifically at the hormones. So we mentioned aldosterone, the antidiuretic hormone we mentioned as well. And there's another that we will mention here, the atrial natriuretic hormone that we didn't take a look at in the previous slide. Aldosterone is ultimately secreted by the adrenal cortex. This is the outer portion of the adrenal gland. It stimulates the reabsorption of sodium back from the distal convoluted tubule into the peritubular capillaries. Because the sodium moves back into the capillaries, the water follows it. The antidiuretic hormone is released from the pituitary gland, and it stimulates reabsorption of water, but in the collecting duct. The atrial natriuretic hormone comes from the atria of the heart, and it stimulates the secretion of sodium and water by the kidneys. This is actually the opposite to the function of aldosterone. This allows us to get rid of more water if we have too much in our body. So what are the normal and abnormal constituents of urine? We'll start by looking at the characteristics of urine, like the volume of urine. As mentioned previously, the average amount per day is 1.5 liters, or 1,500 milliliters per day. The pH of urine is slightly acidic, at around 6.0 on the pH scale. We'll take a look at later why it's slightly acidic. The color of urine is normally yellow. but we can use the color to indicate our hydration levels. A deep yellow color is usually the case of dehydration, while a more pale yellow means there's more water and we're overhydrated and our kidneys are trying to get rid of more water. Let's take a look at the normal constituents of things found in urine. So one that was mentioned earlier were nitrogenous wastes, like urea. Hydrogen ions, and we'll take a look at the kidney's role in balancing pH in a few moments here. Excess water. Excess electrolytes like sodium or potassium. And creatinine, which is a waste from muscular breakdown of creatine phosphate. Some of the abnormal constituents of urine include protein, glucose, bilirubin, which is a bile precursor. Remember, bile is ultimately made in the liver and is then secreted into the intestines. White blood cells, red blood cells, and hemoglobin. Finally, let's explain the process of urination. Urination, also called micturition or voiding, is the process of expelling urine from the bladder. So we've looked at an image like this earlier. Here we have the ureter, and then the bladder, and then the urethra that goes to the outside of the body. As we'll see here, we have the internal sphincter and external sphincter that help to retain urine within the bladder. We mentioned earlier that there are folds, indicated in the image here, that allow the bladder to expand as more and more urine comes down from the kidneys through the ureters into it. But as the bladder expands more and more and more, eventually the stretching stimulates nerve receptors within the walls of the bladder. That sends signals ultimately to the central nervous system, and we have the urge to urinate. Eventually, when we urinate, the sphincters are relaxed and the muscular layer of the bladder contracts, pushing the urine out of the bladder through the urethra to the outside of the body.